fully confident that this year's MPE-IIA, albeit on a new normal platform and approach, has achieved its desired impacts.
Enhancing not only in the design, but also the delivery of public goods and services for the people. Innovation in government is imperative, not only to transform, but also to stay ahead of change.
To lift student engagement and attainment in innovation and to support teachers and improve student outcome, innovation and technopreneur mind.
Very good morning to all attendees. On behalf of the organizers and the awards chair, we would like to thank you all attendees for your time today in joining the PSIA 2022 webinars. Today, we will be sharing information on the award criteria and some info on what the jurors are looking for during the awards evaluation. The webinar today will be moderated by Encik Hussein bin Muhammad Arif. Encik Hussein is the chair of the awards committee to the Public Service Innovation Awards since 2019. Encik Hussein is also the president of the Malaysian Association of Creativity and Innovation, in short MACRI, and has a vast experience in consultancy, training and commercialization, and is also a certified trainer for Bengkel Kumpulan Kreatif dan Inovatif KIK by Intan Malaysia. Encik Hussein will introduce the speaker today, Mr. Ben shortly. Without further ado, I will pass the floor to Encik Hussein to start the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanli from ProTem. A very good morning to everyone, all the attendees for today's session. Today is actually our second series in a series of 4 webinars relating to our criteria for the Public Service Innovation Awards. There are actually 5 criteria, but in our first session, we lumped in the first two criteria into that particular session for the speaker for that particular session, because quite relevant to the speaker. So, and this time around, we have for our second session, which we will look into the third criteria, is Mr. Ben Trenchard. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Ben Trenchard.
That's, yeah, very good.
All right. Okay. So I will introduce Ben shortly. I will just run through the program flow for today. Right after I've done my introduction and brief about this whole criteria, we will pass over to our guest speaker for today, who will be sharing his experience and how it relates to our particular criteria that we're looking at for today. And we're basically broken up into 2 sessions so that there'll be time for Q&As from all our attendees for today, and also from myself. So there will be interactive, but at the same time, I would like to give opportunity for our guest speaker to present what he has in his slides and sharing his experience and all that. So that will be broken up to 2 sessions. Once we've done with the second session, again, there will be a Q&A. At the end, we'll do a kind of a short selfie or a group photo by the pro tem for our record. And I'm sure for all those who are attending, would like to have also maybe a picture for their own record. As you know, most of these attendees and those who are attending and taking part in the Public Service Innovation Award are for the government sector. So we welcome all of you to this session. And for those who couldn't attend, well, they'll be watching the recorded version of this at their comfort of their home or their convenience of the time. So let me just go into a bit of background, brief bio of Benjamin, which I really had to slim down because there's so many. It would take your time, Ben, if I were to read out the whole thing. The industry began as an intern with the Airbus A380 program back in 2005. Since then, he has extensive hands-on knowledge in innovation with the development of sustainable product supply chains and implementation of innovative technologies, fueled by a desire for increased sustainability and a better user experience. Ben's early career covered research into advanced materials at the University of Bristol, followed by a period working on metallic and composite aircraft primary structure, specializing in fatigue and damage-tolerant design for OEMs, including Airbus. More recently, Ben has supported design and certification projects in the aircraft interior sectors at product and aircraft level. As founder of Reka Blue Sky, based in Kuala Lumpur, as one of the founding team of the newly founded Green Cabin Alliance, Ben is an advocate for cross-industry collaboration as a means to bring meaningful and measurable impact to the sustainability of the cabin interior sector. So for today's session, Ben brings with him over 20 years of experience in the innovative product development cycle, with in-depth knowledge in the importance of certification to ensure safe and sustainable user experience. This series will talk about the PSIA's evaluation criteria, which is the innovative solution developed and implemented. And this is the criteria number 3, which brings with it a weightage of about 23% weightage, which is very important to I guess for those taking part in this to get it right. And for all those who are familiar with the government's initiative in innovation among the public sector, they have this approach which is called the KIK Horizon Baharu, the new horizon for the public sector. And basically PSIA is a model around that, because this is something in order for us, our initiative, to make it easy for you to take part, because you are doing innovative projects, improving your processes and so forth, and you are using the format as provided by the government of Malaysia, using the project, using the KIK Horizon Baharu format and so forth. So we are actually using that model to simplify, but at the same time, we've also made our criteria also simplified even more. Innovative solution developed and implemented. However, because I've shared the KIK Horizon Baharu detailed format with Ben, he actually will be sharing in his slide how, through his observation and how he evaluates innovation projects, will somehow include some of the sub-criteria in this particular criteria, which is tindakan penyelesaian, which is the action that you have taken in solving the problem. Essentially, that's what it means. All right. Yeah, I think that's it for now. So I will now pass on to Ben to present his slide. and then perhaps halfway through, we will open up for a Q&A. So anyway, Ben, over to you, mate.
Okay, thank you very much. And,
oh, by the way, if you're having coffee, we encourage you to. It's like a coffee session between the two of us.
I need to place an order with my wife. But yeah, thank you very much for that introduction, Hussein, and it's a pleasure to be invited to be part of this webinar this morning, and to be part of the process of the NTE and specifically the public sector awards. So I've had the pleasure of being involved in quite a lot of innovation projects over my career, and more recently been involved in this kind of innovation competition and innovation training programs that are being run in Malaysia. So I've been in Malaysia for 6 years, so I'm familiar, but still learning very much about how things work here. But it's very, very positive to see the steps that are being taken to promote innovation amongst the younger generations, especially. So I'll just share my slides a second. Is everybody able to, are you able to see that, Hussein, the slides? Okay, excellent. So I think obviously I had a very good introduction from Mr. Hussein there. But what I'd like to do is to start with just a kind of extended introduction for you guys, so that you can see a little bit about my career path, the areas I've worked in, and how that's intersected with innovation. So why actually for myself, innovation is a very important topic. It's not something that stands alone. I think quite often there can be a tendency to see innovation as this island, something we do separately to our day-to-day job. It's time to go and innovate now. Whereas actually, the reality is it's part of day-to-day life for most people in their careers, even if they don't realize that they're doing it. So to give a kind of overview of my career path, I started as a structural engineer. So essentially that means that my job was to look at pieces of structure on the aircraft, perform calculations, decide on the size, the thickness of those materials, and determine were they fit for purpose. So very much an engineering role. And as engineers, we have we're very methodical, we're very structured. We begin with a set of requirements, we develop our solution, and then we, at the end, we do checks or tests or analysis, and we revert back to that, those initial requirements. If we meet those requirements, then our job is done. So actually, in itself, engineering is an innovation role, if you like. As I moved forward in my career, I moved from looking at structure to looking at cabin interiors. Now, the big difference between those two areas is that most people never see the inside structure of an aircraft. So most people never see the inside of a wing or the metallic parts that make up the skeleton of that aircraft. But what people do see is the cabin interior. So when I moved from designing structures where I had a very limited set of requirements, it must be this strong, it must last this many flights, into cabin interiors, all of a sudden I had a whole new set of requirements on top of what I was looking at. So if you imagine something like an aircraft seat, all of a sudden I have to concern myself with, is this seat comfortable? Does the seat look nice? Does it match the branding of the airline? Is it safe? Does it cause any fire risk and things like that. So moving from engineer to design was really just an expansion of the areas that I had to look at. And as I got more experience in the industry, my level was rising. And rather than being on the ground working on the analysis or the calculations or the design, I then found myself managing projects. And again, the process is very similar. But essentially, when we get to the level of managing projects, I then have to take into account all of the different stakeholders. So I'm then looking at the structural designers will have one set of requirements. The people looking at the cost of the product will have another set. The people who are looking at maybe environmental or sustainability concerns will have another set of requirements. So again, the process is not different. It's still a case of managing. How do we manage that, that process? But now, as we move up, we have to have a broader viewpoint. And now, after something like 20 years in the industry, I'm now acting as a consultant, where hopefully that means that all of that experience I can now kind of pass on to people in terms of specialist knowledge and support and in guiding them through that process. So, and as Hussein mentioned at the beginning, my career has been in several different areas as well, starting with structures, moving into the cabin interiors, which is far more exciting. But then more recently, something that I think has become more prominent globally and for every industry is sustainability. So actually, as an industry, aviation is considered a significant contributor to climate change. And so 2 years ago, I took the decision to move my career towards sustainability. And now I'm very much focused on how do we bring technologies and innovation into the aviation world that can support it becoming more sustainable. So there are a lot of challenges there, and I'm going to talk a little bit in my slides about some of the challenges and specific to aviation and how we can overcome them. But most of all, I really hope that by sharing my experience through my career and my kind of perspective on what innovation is and how it's managed will be useful to you. And on top of that, I hope that I can link that back to the specific criteria that we're talking about today. I think that everybody is here because they've entered into the competition. They want to they obviously want to do well. You know, you want to present your idea in the best possible way. So if I can help you to understand what we're looking for on behalf of the panel and the judges, I hope that will help you as you move forward in developing your presentations and information in support of the competition. So I think I've already talked a little bit about this, but I think it's important again to reiterate that for me, as somebody that's been involved in innovation from as a very small part of a very large complex product like a full aircraft, down to individual innovations in terms of processes, maybe manufacturing processes or design processes, that innovation is not something we do in isolation. It's part of our core role, whatever your job description is. But in order to understand it, I like to understand it really as a process. So innovation is a structured process where we go from, I think, the criteria 1 and 2 that we talked about in the last webinar, which is how do we empathize with our a customer or the person that's going to be using our solution, and how do we develop our problem statement. That's covered by criteria 1 and 2. When we get to the implementation, this criteria 3, how do we go from what that need is, what that problem statement is, through to an actual final solution. And very importantly, and importantly for you guys that are putting in your submissions, how do we record and document the process that we went through? And how do we demonstrate to the panel of the judges that our solution meets those criteria and addresses that problem statement? So innovation is not just sitting around a table and coming up with good ideas. That is a very narrow window into what innovation is. That process starts well before with your criteria 1 and 2, understanding the problem and coming up with a problem statement. And it goes through to having the solution in front of you that is not just meets the demands of the problem statement, but is also meets the demand of any industry level requirements, any regulations, and is essentially fit to enter the market or be implemented. So we're really dealing with the hands-on stage of the process here. Now, as I mentioned, I've had several roles through my career. So as an engineer, as a project manager, and as a designer. And I think that each of those roles has a specific part to play in the innovation process. So as an engineer, we can bring a process-driven mindset, very structured in thinking. We like to have a plan that goes ABC. And also we're very conscious of engineering constraints. So by that means, do we have a limit on cost? Do we have a limit on what materials we can use? Do we have a limit on how we can implement our solution? As a project manager, we manage the resources and time that we have. Now, everybody in the chat room, I think, will have had to deal with that as well, because nobody has an infinite budget or infinite resources. And that has to be a part of how we approach our solution. Actually, a lot of the problems in the world would be very easy to solve with an infinite budget and an infinite amount of time. So it's a very important part. And then, of course, we have the creativity, open-mindedness, kind of blue ocean thinking part, which is quite often the trickiest part. It's the part where we get given a blank sheet of paper and a problem, and we're told to go and create. So really, in what the judges will expect to see, I think will be a little bit of all of those roles merged into one, because say you need to show and demonstrate how you, not just that your solution is good, addresses the needs, but how you did that and what the process was that you went through. So in your response, in your package that shows your solution, try to think a little bit like an engineer, a little bit like a designer, and a little bit like a project manager. That would be my advice. I guess I can expand a little bit on the aviation industry as well. Now, each industry and each sector within it will have its own specific challenges. I know that these awards are targeted specifically at public sector innovation. So obviously a lot of that will involve working with GLCs and government bodies and agencies. So that in itself will come with its own challenges and difficulties. For aerospace, we have some kind of counterbalancing things going on there. So actually, a lot of people, when I mention that I work in aerospace or in aviation, they think, wow, that's very high tech, very cutting edge. It must be at the very front of technology. That must be where a lot of innovation is taking place. And that is true. So actually our customers, so the airlines, the operators, are very demanding. They have a requirement that we will make products which are faster, lighter, cheaper, always better than the previous generation of products. But to counterbalance that, it's an extremely safety-focused industry. So one of the things that we're always conscious of is that our innovations cannot reduce the levels of safety from one generation to the next. We have a high level of regulation. So we have regulation at a national level. So we have FAA in the US, EASA monitoring Europe, and in Malaysia, the CAM, which is the Civil Aviation Authority Malaysia. And they will monitor the design, the manufacturing, and the operations of any products that are put into an aircraft. So we have a lot of oversight into what we can do in terms of our design. And as somebody that's is now working in aerospace innovation, balancing these is perhaps the key to the challenge, really. So as I put there, how we manage these competing demands is the key to successful innovation within the industry. So maybe as the entrants or participants, you could take some time as well, just to think about, okay, what are the things in my industry or in my sector or in my part of the business which make innovation more challenging, and what are the things which are driving innovation? Do we have customers that are requiring new products, new services, but we have issues because of budget and timescale, or really trying to understand what are the things behind that are driving in your particular sector. Oops, next slide. So I think obviously as an innovation contest as well, we'll see that the projects that you've entered, or your entrants, some of them may be complex, some of them may be quite simple. That's not something that is necessarily going to affect your outcome in the competition. Actually, sometimes the simplest ideas are the best ones. But just to give you an idea of why we focus on innovation as a process, it's because when you're looking at small, simple projects, it's something that we can almost do intuitively. We do it without thinking, and we do it without writing it down or structuring it. I think, oh, I have a problem. I get a sheet of paper, I write some solutions, I go away, I look, does this solution work for me? Yes, it does. Okay, the process is complete. Now, when we look at something on the scale of a complete aircraft, the complexity is huge. There may be 50,000 parts on a particular aircraft. The design process itself, from a problem statement or a user requirement, can take 10 years until the product is complete and in service. I'll show you on the next slide what that process might look like. So one of the things that we do in terms of a whole aircraft design is break that down into stages. Now, it may not be necessary to do that for some of your projects, but it's important to understand that we don't have to do this in one chunk. And actually, one of the main reasons that we do this is because the information and the various subcomponents that are being designed all impact our solution. So we're doing a lot of iteration during the design process. And I think that that's something that, again, it might be happening without you realizing it, but as you're innovating, as you're coming up with your solutions, you will be going round and round and round and round in small circles, making your solution better at each step. And if you can capture that and communicate that with us as a panel or as a team of judges, we'll begin to understand how what the process is that you've been through. So I mentioned that for an aircraft, the process extremely complex. So I'm not expecting anybody to understand or learn anything from this diagram, but it's really to show you that actually, although this is a 10-year process with perhaps, you know, there may be 50 companies involved, 10,000 engineers, multi-million dollar budget, this process is just as applicable to small scale innovation and individual project level innovation. And one of the key parts of this process is considering how we test, prototype and validate our design as we go through. So roughly speaking, we go through a set of stages. Feasibility, where we confirm that the solution that we're developing is actually going to meet the needs of the user or the market requirement. Then selecting a concept and developing that concept. We define an initial design, and we go through this cycle where we analyze, we design components, we build up a model, we validate that model, and then we go back to the beginning again once we have the data from that testing process. So I mentioned the iteration and the cyclic nature of it. We may go through 20, 30 loops of the design process before we end up near this end where we look at certification and entry into service of the aircraft. So quite often you'll see innovation displayed as a linear process. Ideate, implement, and actually it's important to remember that process, ideation and implementation, we can go round and round and round as many times as we like to make sure that we get the best product or solution at the end of that process. So I hope that going into depth into aviation hasn't gone too far beyond the scope of what you're looking at. And I hope that it's able to see the relevance of why we focus so much on process and monitoring and reporting how you've come up with the innovation, because when you begin to scale that into larger and larger projects and bigger innovations, there is a need to manage that process. So, slide. And again, this diagram is something that I saw very early in my career, but I think it's something that's very relevant to anybody that's starting to work in areas where you have multiple disciplines working together to create a solution. What it shows really here is, okay, so when we're designing an aircraft, we have multiple different groups involved. So as I said, maybe 10,000, 15,000 engineers, all trying to innovate towards one product. So on one hand, we might have a group that is only focused on the weight of the aircraft, one that is only focused on the aerodynamics of the aircraft, one that is only focused on the propulsion of the aircraft. And this diagram is really meant to show how disastrous it might be if we let just one of those voices have their say in the process, and how important it is that we can take into account the voices from all of the stakeholders when we're going through the innovation process. So you can see here, if we let the power plant or propulsion group design the aircraft, we'll end up with one big engine. It's got no wings. So you see that's going to cause us a problem. Obviously the computer-aided design group, they like everything nice and square, so it's easy for them to model. So, it's all about balancing. So I think that just to close this section, I've talked a lot about products and product innovation. That's really because my background and my experience is in developing complex products, whether it's at the level of an aircraft or a seat or something apart from for the aircraft. But for you guys, I think, remember that innovation does go beyond products. It includes new business models, it includes new services and new processes. And the same tools, methods and approaches can be used whether we're talking about a product or a process or a business model. So quite often the textbooks, the guidance online will focus on product development as innovation. Don't be put off by that. If you're developing a service, use the model, try to understand how that fits to your situation. Like I say, innovation is a process. It's not something specific. It's not, it's not creating a new product. It's the process we go through to create the new product. So I think that's really covered kind of my background and my sort of thoughts and beliefs on innovation, which I hope have been useful. I think now we can start to go into a little more depth on the criteria. As Mr. Hussain mentioned, the specific criteria we're looking at in this case is innovative solution developed and implemented. So it has this criteria does have a weighting of 23% of the overall marking. So it's quite significant in terms of the overall scoring for your project. And there are 4 sub-criteria, if you like, that perhaps in the next session, we can go into depth on these 4 sub-criteria. So what we want to understand as panelists or as judges when we're looking at your solution, for this criteria, there are 4 things. The first one is strategies in developing the solution. Now, this is quite often called ideation, and essentially this covers the very beginning of the process. So how did you go from a problem statement or a user requirement? How did you come up with the idea for your innovation? So in this criteria, when we go into detail, maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the approaches for that. But generally, I think for those of you that are familiar with design thinking, this links very closely with the concept of design thinking, which is really gives you a kind of toolkit and set of techniques and approaches that we can use to facilitate this step. So the most common one by far is brainstorming. So brainstorming can be structured or unstructured. We can sit around a table and brainstorm. We can brainstorm as an individual as well. There are lots of ways to do it. But the design thinking as a toolkit gives you lots of different tools to approach this problem. Now, for presenting your projects, the key here is how do you communicate that to us? How do you show us what was the process you went through in ideation? And also, I think here we can have a bit of a discussion about why it's important that we are honest to that process. And we don't try and create a story around how we came up with the idea. We can be very honest about how that happened. And, you know, because there are lots of ways of doing it. The second sub-criteria will be looking at prototyping and testing and how that's part of the innovation process. So I've already mentioned a little bit about how significant and important that is in the aerospace world, where we do an awful lot of prototype testing, an awful lot of full-scale testing before an aircraft is ever created. So we can go into a little bit of detail about how how to report that as well. The third sub-criteria looks specifically at how do we certify our innovation, or what is the need for certification of our innovation. Now, certification is really looking where prototyping and testing is looking at our internal requirements as an innovator. Certification is driven by the industry or the external requirements. So this is about very much putting your innovation into context, looking at where your innovation fits into the real world or into the business that you're operating in, and understanding how does that innovation impact other stakeholders, and what do we need to put in place to ensure that that product is acceptable. And then the fourth, sub-criteria is looking specifically at the implementation of the innovation. So the later sub-criteria, I think, look at specifically your outcomes. They look at the impact. This implementation stage is really looking at how you monitor and report and what progress was made during this implementation stage. So how far were you able to develop the product? How far were you able to take it towards commercialization? And how you report that process to the judges. I hope that's roughly aligned with your expectations, Hussein, in terms of the criteria.
That's very much in line, and I've just jotted down a few key words that I like to just have a chat with you on this. As you presented, there were some pointers that I got from your sharing, and most definitely, it's actually important for us to get some I would say insights from the industry, but that's part of the spirit of our you could say the competition. As you know, I think in part of the video, one of our minister did mention that he hopes that all these expos and competitions is not just for the purpose of winning awards. Of course, it's a celebration. It's a celebration of what they have done, the amount of time and effort that they've gone into developing solutions to make basically their delivery system better for the overall. So it's an opportunity to celebrate that. But of course, in any kind of competition, there will be and so forth. So yeah, it is good that we can get some insights from the industry, and that's the purpose of our session with you, Ben. And as you were presenting, I was jotting down a few things like I've picked up on, and I see that in your industry, your approach obviously is very holistic. You see, it's very holistic. As being in the aerospace industry, I think the safety cannot be compromised. Yeah, because we have a mutual friend that we know, which is Dr. Rahmat Shazi from Shah's Innovation. And I remember him telling me about how important it is when it comes to safety certification, when it comes to aircraft, because if it's a car, it's on the ground. You've still got the ground to sort of stop you from anything. But aircraft, if anything happens, there's a breakdown designing your glide, as you mentioned, to glide slowly down to earth. So that's why certification is important. So yeah, from what I see, it's a very holistic, even more so. And as you touched, it may look lateral, but actually there are a lot of loops going on from one process to another. But it is similar, as you said, it is similar to, it can be a kind of a generic approach to all innovation projects. And I've also taken note that you've mentioned the importance of meeting the stakeholders' expectation, which is actually part of this KIK thing that I mentioned to you. There is that, especially in criteria 1 and 2, it's in criteria 2, it talks about how it has to meet the stakeholders and obviously the users, the people who are actually benefiting from innovation. So and you've touched on that also. So SDG, I think it's Sustainable Development Goals. That is also part of the, I think, it's not specifically mentioned in the criterion now for PSIA, but I think in the any of the government projects that they're doing, they are emphasizing on this SDG thing. So we would be looking out, I guess, when we are evaluating projects that are in line with the Malaysian agenda for sustainable development goals. And I like how you touched on resources, because that is something that everyone faces. I don't think anyone, in my experience with the government sector, resources is always limited. There's always a budget. There's always limited in terms of time. The people who can be involved in their project. It can be maybe even limited in terms of expertise. So we tell them to, you can. However, in our approach in this innovation, we do tell them that actually where we are looking at is the ideas itself. It's developed internally, but you can engage with a third party. Yeah, if the budget permits, it is okay to engage with outsiders. Let's say if you have a project that requires some improvement in your system, yeah, IT system and all that. Now you could either develop, of course we will encourage you to develop internally, but if the ideas come internally and you do have a budget, you can actually engage a third party to actually make it a reality, make your ideas reality. We still accept and still celebrate those kind of innovation. So there are many in that kind of Ben, just to share with you, Ben, there are many in that kind of situation or in that kind of approach that's taken. For example, if on a physical kind of on how to reduce the number of illegal banners and stickers, that are being put up along the pole, light poles and all that. So they may have an idea, they may have some drawings about it, about the device that they've come up with, but they don't have the expertise to actually build it. So they are actually encouraged to engage with outsiders to say, okay, this is what I want to be done, and then they pay someone to do it. But the idea is actually we're celebrating the idea and of course implementing it. You might have a wonderful idea, you pay someone to do it, and then you just keep it and just take part in the competition. We don't want that. We want something that you actually have developed, done some testing and all that, and actually really implement. So which is what is being covered in our criteria number 3, is about the implementation. And I think there's one word that one particular keyword that you mentioned, highlight here, that perhaps maybe just to get your explanation about this validation. Now, from what I see, what the government sector has been doing all this while, I think validation in Bahasa Malaysia is called pengesahan, yeah, to in a way like to confirm what do you think the solution should achieve. So it's kind of like to check with what is being expected. So it's just that we do not highlight exactly. So I want your thoughts on this validation. Does it mean if it's just, let's say I've done something and I did a survey, is that enough in terms of validation, Ben?
I mean, it depends on the product, but I think your interpretation is correct. In terms of the translation there, where it's essentially a check. Right. I think the reason that it's important is that we need to remember that as we go through the process, we always need to look back to where we started and what was our problem statement. It's very easy to get very caught up or involved in the innovation itself. As on small scale projects or personal projects, people get very passionate. People put a lot of their energy and commitment into their innovation. So there is a risk that when perhaps some data presents itself which doesn't support the way that you're going, you might miss that because you're so caught up and you know, you love your own product so much. It's like your own child, you know, you put your energy, your efforts into it.
Right.
So when I talk about validation, it's really as part of this cyclic process, but mainly the most important thing is that as you move forward, you always check back to what your initial problem statement was, your user requirement was. In engineering terms, that would be your specification or your requirements document. So you know, don't allow your scope or your direction to drift away from your original intention. So when I guess when I mention validation in that context, it's really make sure that at each step as you move forward, as you commit more time, more resources, that you're still on the right path. Right. Now, in aerospace, we do that in a very structured way using things called gate reviews. So there may be 4 or 5 specific phases to a design. And before we move from one to the next, we will have a specific review where we bring everybody from every department into one room, and we go around the room and we say, okay, does this design meet your expectation? Yes, yes. As long as we get yeses from everybody, we move from phase A to phase B. If one of those people says, actually, no, you know, actually this aircraft doesn't fly high enough, it's not fast enough, you know, it doesn't meet the requirement, we stay in phase A until we're confident. But it's really a case of making sure that you're always on the right path with your innovation.
Right. Okay. Good. It's good that you shared that, because in the process that they have normally, it's when they've actually built the prototype, so they do a testing. So they test and see whether it meets maybe certain targets that they've given. Let's say, for example, I've come up with a device that will dismantle these illegal banners, buntings that be put up. Previously, you used to take maybe, let's say, an hour. Let's say, maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe, but maybe let's say 30 minutes just to dismantle one, and it requires 2 of my workforce to dismantle with the themselves target. If we can reduce this time by, let's say, by half, okay, we are able to meet, because perhaps the problem statement is there's just too many of these illegal buntings and they are not able to catch up with the load. So they have the need to innovate is because they need to reduce the amount of time. Yeah, perhaps let's say if they're clear on that. So upon developing the device, then they will have to test and say, okay, now let's see, can we achieve that target that we've given, 50 minutes? So I guess validating is to see whether, okay, you did a test, okay, is it correct? Did you achieve that target that you meet? And did you require another person, or was one person enough? Did you need a ladder? Did you come up with a device that could really get high up there? And could it really cut because it's you know, these illegal banners are being tied with using perhaps wires or thick ropes and all that. So the device needs to be, they need to confirm that. They need to confirm the other aspects of their work process. Does it make it possible for them to actually go out and engage in this new method, or you know, developing this? So they are encouraged to go through that process of testing. So if it doesn't achieve the target, then they're encouraged to look at, okay, now how can we make it better? So they're like, but usually from my observation, it's like 2 or 3 versions. They've done 2 or 3 prototypes, they've modified, and then you come to maybe the 3rd version, and the 3rd version is the one where it achieves their expectation. So perhaps if I'm correct, that would be the validation, means to validate that they've, you know, met that. And perhaps as you mentioned, is it safe to use? So they need to, you know, ask around, as you mentioned the example you had. Perhaps they need to ask and say, okay, with this device, although it achieved, but is it comfortable to use? Is it safe to use? Yeah. So now they might be able to get that PSIA or the KIK Horizon Baru maybe goes a little bit further also because this is part of, I guess, their seriousness in making sure that the innovation gets implemented throughout, not only throughout the department or the organization, but perhaps there is potential for it to be replicated outside. So we go further in terms of, which is I'm sure something definitely aerospace industry goes to, which is we call it the certification part. And I think maybe Ben will be touching on that, the certification part. So that is I guess, am I right to say that certification and validation, they are two separate things, right? They're not really the same?
Not really the same. No, I think you're absolutely right in your kind of interpretation of validation. So I think it's important to understand the definition, the distinction between a prototype and what its function is,
right.
A validation model, and a certification. So just in very simple terms, a prototype doesn't necessarily have to show the full capabilities of your innovation. So I'll give aircraft as an example. So we may, during the process of designing an aircraft, we may decide that we just want to build one wing just to see whether that wing is behaving in the same way that our models are behaving, the weight is correct, and all of these things. Now that would be considered a prototype because it's proving a specific characteristic, or we can test certain parameters of our model. But the wing itself can't fly, so we can't validate just a wing because it doesn't tie back to our original requirement to build a whole aircraft. So in terms of validation, what we need to do is as you said, prove that the assumptions that we've made as we go through are correct, and that what we've finished with meets those expectations and the original requirements. So for your example of the banner removal, so through that process, maybe somebody made some assumptions on how long it would take the man to climb the ladder and remove the banner. Now, when we do our testing, we need to validate that those assumptions that we made were correct. Were we correct to assume that this tool can remove this this type of connector or something?
True. That is something that we come across situations where there could be a fair bit of element of assumption, because they never really took the trouble to really get the data, to really time. Let's say they say, okay, it takes a long time, but how much is a long time? And they may say, okay, it takes half an hour. Now, have you really timed yourself to see whether the old method, does it really take 30 minutes and so?
That's right. If I want to, I know, maybe I want to drive somewhere 200 kilometers away, I'll assume I can drive at 100 kilometers an hour, so it will take me 2 hours. But then when I get into the car and I try to do that, there's lots of reasons why that might not happen. So
that's right.
It's important, that we always check that the assumptions we're making are correct.
Right. True.
Process.
That's good. You're right about that. And I to be honest with you, in the criterion number 2, they're supposed to share that. In criterion 2, they're supposed to show data that is real data, and that's why I think if you look at our for the scoring page for this criteria, we have in bracket proof. So quite a number of these things they need to show proof about the problem statement itself. How often does it happen and things like that. So they are encouraged to share proof on that, and of course in a whole process, and they're supposed to show the journey. Pictures, I guess, will play that role of showing proof, and then of course the validation, they need to show that. And then the certification. Now, certification, of course, is a big thing to expect a government department to come up with certification, because One, because you're talking about something that normally industry would be looking at certification, but the government departments and agencies, they are encouraged to, but we try to get them to at least know that there is that need. There is that need to certify, and maybe you might not get the final certification, but you're on that journey. So that's why we have the scale of 1 to 10, meaning if you've taken that path of getting certification, perhaps not in time for the competition, not in time for the expo, but perhaps you can show some proof that you are engaging with these relevant agencies in order to get that certification. Sometimes from what I see, able to get at least some kind of a letter to say that this particular agency has looked at their solution and they have no objection to it, or they'll say that it's a good thing. But I would consider that as more like a testimonial, because they are not a governing body that certifies. Sometimes the best that they can do maybe is some testimonial, but certification is a very specific thing in our criteria, also our sub criteria, because we're looking at, okay, now, we I guess over the years we've done with a lot of these projects that just enter competition for the purpose of competition, and they are not really seriously being implemented within that department. So we're trying to say, look, if you really want, and then you want to replicate it, you got to get this thing, at least looked into. And I'm happy to share with you, Ben, that there are quite a number over the 10 years that I've been involved in the public sector's innovation. There are quite a number who are able to, maybe JKR, which is the roadworks agency. So they are able to, so it's no excuse for others. It's just that sometimes I feel the challenge is it's time. They couldn't get it ready in time for the competition. So they always tell them, look, start your project early, work backwards, kind of thing. So yeah. So
I think that's very interesting. So from a certification background as well, I think that really certification is a lot of it is about risk, and managing the risk. So I think, like you said, certification, depending on the complexity and what type of certification we're talking about, it costs time, it costs money, it can be an extremely lengthy process. And for some of these projects, absolutely, it's not an expectation that the full certification will be in place. But the most important thing, from my perspective at least, would be that any relevant certifications that are required have been identified. And like you said, if possible, that there's been some sort of engagement with that certifying body, at least to, like you say, if there's a testimonial, or at least something to say, actually, we've looked at your idea, we think it is certifiable, although this might take, a number of years, or this testing program must be needed, or things like that. So, the fact this is in there, in the criteria, it's a good kind of indicator to the attendees that actually don't have that blind spot. I can give you a good example from aerospace, and I'm sure you're familiar with the drone industry and the huge rise in drone technology. So Malaysia itself is actually, it has the world leading drone services company in Aerodyne. A huge number of drone services companies that are operating across agriculture, drone logistics, drone photography, and all of these areas. But the reality is that the certification of drones, drone hardware, drone operations, drone pilots, is a long way behind the technology. So I think that, maybe 15 years ago, you could walk into a store and you could buy a quadcopter drone off the shelf, weighing a couple of kilos, and you could fly it up to 800 feet in the sky,
Yeah.
No regulation, no certification requirements. The unfortunate thing about that is if the battery runs out and it falls on someone's head, it's going to do a lot of damage. It's going to cause a lot of issues. So actually, the industry is behind the innovation in this case.
Right.
Drone regulations are being put into place now by IASA, by the CAAM, so the Civil Aviation Authority of Malaysia. They've recently formalized their requirements for drone training. For I think about 2 years now, they've had a certification approval process for operating drones commercially. So if you want to go and do some mapping with a drone and make some money using that drone, you now need permission from MCMC, JUPEM,
Yes.
CAM. You know, I think seven different government agencies are involved in that application process.
Right.
So it's really a case of you have to, even if that regulation or certification doesn't exist yet in your industry, it might be coming. If your technology is too far ahead of the regulation, you have to be conscious. You know, flying cars or electric cars, there's probably no regulation in Malaysia regarding electric cars and how they're operated. But when that technology arrives onto the market, that regulation will come. So it's not always just a case of we look at the rules as they are now and we certify to that. We have to look forward. We have to manage the risk of compliance for anything that we're developing. For the guys here working in public services, obviously there may be a lot of agencies involved that, as you mentioned, they don't necessarily have a strict certification policy you have to adhere to, but you would still need their support or their approval or their licensing to go ahead with your business model or your process.
Right.
Thinking about, for example, if your innovation has some sort of environmental impact or creates waste, then you would need to approach the relevant authorities within Malaysia to say, look, okay, I have this process, it creates this byproduct. How, you know, what can I do with that?
Right.
So it's important that at least all of the stakeholders are identified and any kind of future risks are identified as well in terms of products or process certification.
All right. So Ben, I believe you have like the second part of continuation, so I don't want to interrupt you. Maybe part of my question or discussion with you has kind of touched on that, but perhaps I pass it on to you to continue your second part, Ben. Is it okay?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, great.
So yeah, for the second part, I really wanted, I mean, it was kind of like the conversation we just had, but just to drill down into these 4 sub-criteria a little bit, give my thoughts on them and what the most important aspects of those criteria are. So I think this will probably take 20 minutes, and then after that we can go to some Q&A and hear if anybody has any questions. So coming back to the sub-criteria, I wanted to rephrase them into a question, just to make that clear to people. What really are we asking for each of these sub-criteria? So for sub-criteria A, strategies in developing the solution, what we're really looking for is how did we address our problem statement, and how did we form the idea or the innovation that we're presenting. In terms of sub-criteria B, where we're looking at prototyping and testing, I think we discussed this just now at some length, but how do we prove that our solution actually meets those requirements, meets the requirements of the problem statement, and then the broader requirements of any industry or certification requirements. In terms of certification, again, we had a bit of a talk there, but that is does the solution that we've come up with, or does our innovation meet the requirements of industry? I think again, it's important to consider not just the current requirements of industry, but the fact that over time, the requirements of industry are constantly evolving and changing. I think environmental standards are a really good example of that, where if you go back 20, 30 years, there were materials and products and processes that we were able to use. Things like CFCs were being used in products and fridges and things like that. Those have now been banned and outlawed. So we need to be conscious that regulations are not rigid and fixed. Regulations will also change. And also that because we're talking about innovation, which is at the forefront of technology or process, sometimes we're ahead of the regulators. So that's an important thing we can touch on as well. And in terms of implementation, what we really want to know as panelists and judges is how did you manage the process of developing your solution, and what did you achieve? So how far did you go on your journey towards a commercial product or a fully implemented product? And how did you get there? What were the steps you took, and how did you manage the process? So thinking about those sub-criteria, I mentioned design thinking earlier in the presentation. And I think it's worth, for those of you that aren't familiar with design thinking, go and have a read about it, find out what it's all about. It's not a strict methodology. It's not a process where we go A, B, C, D, E, I've done design thinking. It's really a toolbox of different tools and techniques and things we can dip into when we want to achieve certain things for each of these stages of the design process. So I think, as I already mentioned, the definition and empathize stages, which come early in the design thinking process, are really covered by criteria 1 and 2. When we're talking about criteria 3 and implementation, we're really looking at these four steps where we brainstorm our solutions, we test, we prototype, and then we implement. So if you go and take a look at some information on design thinking, and you look at some of the tools that it will give you for these stages, it may be helpful in terms of how you present the process that you've been through. It also, I find design thinking useful in terms of giving us good language to discuss innovation and discuss where we are in the process and the specific steps that we went through. So if you're not familiar with design thinking, I'd recommend spending some time familiarizing yourself with the concepts and the ideas, because they can be useful tools in your work, but also in communicating your work to other people through a kind of standardized set of stages and language. So if we look at each of these sub-criteria in a little bit more depth now. So the ideation stage, or strategies in developing the solution, really comes down to how did we address the problem statement. Now, for me, it's important again to realize that ideation is a process. It's the process of generating solutions that meet your problem statement. Doesn't necessarily mean coming up with one killer idea. Ideation can generate hundreds of ideas. And then how you manage and funnel those ideas into your solution is all part of the innovation management. So we see, for me, the ideation stage is really a case of filling your bucket at the beginning of the process with as many ideas as you can, coming up with as many ways you can see that you can achieve your outcome. it's a core stage in design thinking. So if you do go back to those design thinking resources, you can look at ideation, and there'll be a toolkit there. You can look at things like brainstorming. There are probably 30 or 40 different individual techniques or workshopping tools or methods that you can apply to do this. And to be honest, design thinking is a relatively new concept. Humans have been coming up with ideas long before design thinking was ever created. So I like to think that even somebody that's never heard of design thinking, you're probably doing one of these methods without knowing about it. Brainstorming is a great example. Yes, it's part of design thinking. Yes, it's a structured method or unstructured method, but essentially having a group of people sitting around the table and allowing ideas to come out without being dismissive of ideas is not a new concept. Again, learning about design thinking will give you language to communicate that as part of your documentation in a more formal way. So rather than saying, to come up with my ideas, I sat with 3 friends and we talked about this and that, you can reference that as, going through the ideation stage of the design thinking process. We used structured brainstorming, and we down selected our ideas or categorized our ideas, X, Y, Z. So it's not about, if you didn't come up with these ideas using design thinking, you don't have to say you did, but you can use the language of design thinking to help communicate what you did. So, it's important that we're honest with ourselves as well. If you weren't doing something at the time, don't say that that's what you did. But that's not to say that maybe you did it by accident, right? So keep that in mind. And then linking that back to, I think what I talked about at the start of my presentation. Yes, ideation is a creative step. Some people, I've talked to a lot of students before working on innovation projects, and some of them will say, I'm not a creative person, I'm not a creative person. And the reality is ideation is a creative process. We're synthesizing, we're creating something from nothing. But having these processes and methodologies in place help people like me, an engineer that's not creative. I enjoy structure, I enjoy process. These help me to be creative. They help me to identify areas where we can promote innovation. And the management and the documentation of this ideation stage is something that, if you implement it, it will have benefits. It will give you advantages in your projects. So I guess my takeaway or my philosophy on ideation is that don't limit yourself by your own beliefs. Don't let's say, I'm not creative. I'm just an engineer. I'm just a numbers guy, or I like analysis. I can't come up with new things. If you use the right tools and methodologies, the ideas will come. And it's all about how you manage and document that process. The better that you manage and document the process, the easier it is for us as panelists and judges to understand the process you went through. And that's really important for us when we're assessing the quality of your ideation stage. So then let's look at the second sub-criteria, which is prototyping and testing, or essentially how do we prove that our solution meets our user requirements or our problem statement. So for me, as we've seen in the aerospace world, prototyping and testing is a huge part of the process. What we don't do is decide we want to build an aircraft that looks like this. And the first thing we do is we start to cut metal and bolt things together and, you know, create an aircraft. And then we realize, oh, this isn't quite what we wanted. We use prototyping and testing as a tool, and it has advantages that are just as applicable in small projects. So those advantages are that it gives us freedom to design openly, not just design physically, not just design products, but to design our processes and services or business models as well. So by prototyping, we're taking a small set of our requirements and we're testing against those requirements. So I gave the example earlier of let's just build an aircraft wing. Well, the same could be true of a process innovation. You're coming up with a new business process which is complex. It has multiple steps in it. If one of those steps is risky or challenging, can we just build a prototype to test that particular small subset of our innovation and give ourselves some confidence to that that's the right way to go forward. And by doing that, it really gives us a lot more scope to minimize the amount of money and time that we're putting in to the project. So yes, testing and prototyping is costly and time consuming, but the idea overall is that we reduce the total time and cost of the project by breaking our problem down into small steps that we can look at independently. We use prototyping in physical innovation to confirm the form, fit, and function of our products. So, is our product the right shape? Does it do the right thing? The same is true for processes. The other benefit of testing prototyping is that we gain insight. So I think a key takeaway here for me is that if you perform a test and that test fails, that's not a failure for your project. A failed prototype gives you data, it gives you insight, it gives you better understanding of the way that your product or process is working. And it's an essential part of the process. It's not a negative, it's something that is essential and crucial to getting a good product. So be very careful to distinguish between failure of a test and failure of your product. When you're reporting to us about the testing, if you had 99 failures and then one success, we want to hear about the 99 failures as well as the one success. Please don't come and say, I did one test and it was perfect, because that doesn't add any value. It's the 99 tests that you do before that that are adding the value, that are helping you to make a better product with each iteration of that prototype. So again, be very honest and methodical about how you report your testing. And we want to hear just as much about the failures as the successes, because they're what is driving the development. And I touched on this already. Spend less, learn more. Coming back to the aircraft example, or a car or a complex product, we don't want to go through the process of building an entire car to realize that the steering wheel is too big and it won't fit. And we have to redesign the whole car just because of one small thing. So we can spend less because we can break our projects down into smaller chunks and test and validate those specific stages independently. So that to me is the value of prototyping. It's essential, let's put there, it's essential not just to validate your design, but as an area for you to experiment and to give you freedom to try different ideas. I mentioned the bucket of ideas that you get from your ideation phase. Now, that's where prototyping can come in to help you down select from a big bucket of ideas to a smaller bucket. Maybe you've come up with 10 ways that you can solve the same problem, And through prototyping, you could narrow that down to a few ideas that you want to take forward. And then as you move forward, your prototypes can get more complex and closer towards a full product or a proof of concept type product. So the third sub-criteria is certification. In the Malaysian context, that might be Criterion for quality certification. So maybe you may or may not be familiar with Criterion, but certainly you'll have seen their mark on products, electrical products. When you buy an item which has a plug on it, you'll see a Criterion sticker, which gives the consumer confidence that that product meets their quality requirements. So that is a requirement on the product on top of and above whatever the designer had in mind. Now, it may be that that plug designer was an international company. They didn't design specifically for the Malaysian market. This plug is being sold different international markets around the world. But if they want to sell into the Malaysian market, that certification by Criterion is an essential part of their business model to sell products here. So I guess in short, if you're part of a regulated industry, so by regulated industry, that means any industry that has some sort of formal oversight by a government agency, a government body, or maybe even an independent regulator as well. So in aviation, our regulators are sometimes independent, sometimes from the industry, and sometimes from government level. We need to ensure that we meet any certification requirements that are placed on us by that industry or by that regulator. So what this does is it ensures that the innovation is of sufficient quality of design, manufacture, and process. And on top of that, ensures that there are no unexpected consequences to our innovation. So I gave the example of the plug design there. So we can use that again. And one of the criteria, for example, that Criterion might look at when they're evaluating a plug, just a white plastic plug on a device, is how does that plastic behave when there is a fire or when that plastic is heated. So it may be that that product was designed somewhere that didn't have that requirement. They built the product, it meets their requirements, it is the right shape, it fits into the plug socket, it allows electricity to, come from the wall socket into the product. But one unexpected consequence, they may not have considered that that plug may catch fire, and there may be unexpected consequences of that product. So when Criterion comes in, they say, oh, actually, we need you to look beyond your requirements. We need you to consider what happens when this plastic reaches 100 degrees. Does it melt? Does it retain its structural stability? Does it catch fire? Does it explode? So really, the regulators are there to make sure that we've captured all of the requirements that need to be in place. And on top of that, there are legal and liability implications as well. So the regulators are there really as a safety net. They place requirements on us that are above and beyond what we may have come up with ourselves. And they also make sure that any legal and liability issues are addressed as well in those innovations. Now, talking about public services, the clue is in the name. We're interfacing with the Rakyat, we're interfacing with people constantly as part of public services. So it's very important that for any innovation in this area, that we look at what regulations are there, what certifications we might need, and we engage with the right stakeholders. So my key takeaway again is for this innovation, for the solution to be acceptable, it has to meet the regulatory demands of all stakeholders. And that means not just your customers, that means the government, that means any industry bodies that are involved in the particular area. That means looking at any waste or byproducts of your innovation and really taking a very big picture view of your product. So for certification, it's important that we can step back and look at everything that our products might have an impact on. And a final sub-criteria is implementation. Now, I think it should be perhaps the most straightforward of the sub-criteria in this category. So, because what we're asking you is, how did you manage the process and develop the solution, and how successful was that process? Essentially, this is the storytelling part of the process, I guess. We want to know the journey that you've been through. We want to know why you made the decisions you made, but also, whilst the later criteria will look specifically at impact and outcome, this is for us to really look at attainment. So how far down the road towards a commercial or implementable product did you get? Again, I think I've used the word process about 1,000 times, but it's important to me. So managing the implementation of innovation as a process is essential for a successful project outcome. That means that you can use any project management technique. You can use any technique that's designed to manage time and resources and project stages, as long as they work for you. In a lot of the cases, there are standard processes we can go through for design, because industry has created those processes for us, because we've been through the process so many times, it's been standardized. So I mentioned that in aerospace, we typically have this A phase, B phase, C phase design with gate reviews in between. That's common across the entire industry. As an aerospace engineer, I know that a phase A design gate review will involve looking at preliminary design and ensuring that everybody is agreed that that design is sufficient to move on to phase B design. So it's about giving ourselves a common language that we can use to discuss these topics. The key things that we want to see from the participants are the monitoring and reporting monitoring and reporting of progress against the specifications or requirements. So how did you, not only what process did you go through, how did you check what was the monitoring that you had in place as you went through to ensure that you were always on the right track? How did you structure your project? In the case of simple projects, that might be very basic. In the case of projects involving multiple teams or multiple people in teams, how did you structure your time and resources to get the best outcome? And design gate reviews, I think, they're a formal tool. So maybe some of these projects that we see may not have had that. Some of them may have done. But as participants, go in and try and understand a little bit about how we use design reviews or gate reviews to manage that process that I've already described, where we stay in a loop until we're ready, then we move to the next loop, and then we move to the next loop through these processes of gates. For me, it's been a really useful tool in managing complex projects that involve a lot of design iteration. So for innovative projects, there may be a useful tools. And I guess my key takeaway is that actually a lot of people are very good at strategy, ideas, concepts, planning, but implementation is the most common area where innovation projects fail. Innovation isn't a linear process where we just move from one step to the next without thought. It has to be managed well, because it probably poses the most risk to you having a successful outcome. I've been on review panels and boards for probably hundreds of projects in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship, and the implementation stage is always the biggest challenge to those projects. Not least because it's usually the most costly and time consuming. But a properly planned and organized implementation stage can really help you to achieve what you want to achieve at the end of the day. So that's actually my final slide. So I hope that was a useful kind of overview of the 4 sub-criteria. And I hope that my input into it is going to be useful as well. It's very much my opinion. If there's anything that is perhaps not aligned with how the judges will be judging, that would be good to highlight as well. But yeah, I hope it's been useful for all the participants, and I think that now we can have a discussion or move into any Q&A that you might have.
So far they are there, but they're quite shy actually. I can see so far quiet, but I have been getting some have sent those who know me and have my number, they have kind of sent some inquiries by WhatsApp. So I will touch on those. Perhaps they're seeking for clarification. So I think as I've mentioned to you before, Ben, is that we are modeled our PSIA to the KIK Horizon Baharu, but we've also taken made a decision to simplify further, because for the criteria number 3 that we're talking about today, the total weightage is 23%. Now, but for the purpose of the participants who are taking part and who are familiar with KIK Horizon Baharu, I've taken the liberty of getting you to sort of split it into all those sub-criteria, so that I want them to see that it relates very much to the KIK Horizon Baharu. We've basically lumped it up into just 23% for all. That covers all in that particular process of generating the idea, doing your prototype, testing, whether you got certification or testimonial, and the implementation. So although yes, for the purpose of sharing, I think Ben has showed the sub-criteria with the, I think, weightage of 8, and then I think there's like 4 or 3. I can't remember the weightage for that. But just bear in mind that we won't be giving marks for each of those sub-criteria. It's more of to get them to understand that it relates to the Horizon Baharu format. But our marks will be basically just overall. We'll see the overall storyline, the sharing of that part of their process, and we'll be giving like a scale of 1 to 10. What do we as panelists feel that they'll be able to share? Because perhaps some might say you might feel that 4% is a bit too little weighting. I agree with that. Also, it's a very important stage. So that's why I didn't want to be tied to that 4 weightage that has been sort of decided by the government sector. I wanted to make it into a lump sum, a whole in total. So that gives us a bit of freedom, a bit of leeway in terms of when we want to differentiate between groups that have been very advanced in their innovation practice and all that. And I think coming back to the implementation, where the KIK Horizon Baharu actually is looking for is more like, if I can use the same example as the device for dismantling illegal bantings and banners, right? Say if I use that as an example. So now if you come out with your device, you've done your prototype and you've done your testing, proof of concept and all that, you've done your testing, and then it proves that yes, it can help to do that process much faster, yeah, dismantling. So you've done your testing, and then of course we encourage you to try and get some kind of certification. Did use that device, we did it. I mean, it's already included in our official documentation of the SOP. A new SOP has been included in our whether it's part of our ISO documentation. We've put there that using of this device XYZ is part of the new process in terms of dismantling. That's one. That's one we want to see. The other thing we want to see that, so how long have you used it for? How many illegal bantings have you dismantled using this new device? And for how long and for which area? You know, perhaps you're doing it in order to because if you are a municipality, maybe you have many different zones. You have A, B, C, D, E zones. You break it up to different zones. So perhaps initially, when you came up with this project, you wanted to start with zone A. That could be your pilot project. So beyond that, what, and this could be beyond the timeline of your submission. Perhaps you have broken up into 5 different zones. Your innovation for zone A now, and then you had to submit, right? So perhaps as a panelist, I will asking, right, when you finish zone A, is there anything in writing, anything like a memo in your minute, in your meetings, that indicates you are going to be continuing with this for zone, B, C, D, E, and so forth? So those are the things that, because over the years, I realized that we do see quite, although good ideas, but they tend to fall short of that kind of commitment. And it's also actually, in a way, encouraging the groups to ask the top management, look, we need this commitment from the top management, because or else, this is part of the evaluation. They want to see that we are taking on this solution beyond just the prototype or beyond just pilot project. We want to see it really running through. So that's the part where it kind of has a link to the 5th criteria. We are looking more at, so for how long have you used this? Where have you used it? Because it will link to the 4th criteria, which is looking at all the outcomes and impact, the benefits of your innovation. So they need to show the data, and of course they need to show proof, that all this data is real, that they have been able to sort of reduce the time or increase their productivity and so forth. So that links to number 4. So implementation here, it's more of showing in the document for the panelists to evaluate where else, where have you taken it next, after getting the certification. So it's being used, we take it's being used, so for how long, and so forth. So sometimes some may show a graph, some may show in a table to say, okay, we've used it from certain months, certain date from certain date. These are the areas, or maybe, again, I use the example of banting. They could put there, okay, we've dismantled 100 bantings. Previously, we could only dismantle 50 bantings, let's say. But now, because of time, we've reduced the amount of time, we are able to double it up, something like that. So those are the things that will be what we are looking at in terms of the implementation. And so and that's why I say we don't want to tie ourselves to just that sub criteria. It's the overall, as you said, the overall story. We want to see, okay, how did it link to each other and all that. So the whole story is basically in this criteria is 23% weightage. If I can just come back to the design thinking that you mentioned, you're right in a sense that from what I've learned in design thinking, although I can't say I've attended an actual class, a workshop, but it's just through surfing YouTubes and all that. What my take on design thinking, how maybe new and different it is I think the 2 things that I see. One is the empathize empathizing. And I think for design thinking is getting you to put yourself in the shoe of your user, the people who are getting your services. So putting yourself in their shoe. So that's the empathize part. Whereas perhaps before we knew about design thinking, and I think for this KIK approach in innovation, they are usually asked to just do a survey, get some kind of feedback. And it could be no interview. In fact, maybe some don't even interview. They just they give a form and say, okay, yeah, fill up a form and give us your feedback. So my understanding of empathizing is beyond that. You can't say, okay, we use empathize, but so what tools do you use? Well, you use survey form. I said, well, that doesn't really convince me that you've really got the spirit of design thinking. So we encourage them to do that part, which is like maybe shadowing. I think there is like shadowing, doing what do you call that? I think mystery shopper and all those are the tools. It's to really understand the problem from the perspective of the user, because a simple thing I mentioned, sometimes you might think that the problem is at the service counter itself, but if you put yourself in the shoe of the customer, the problem could start from the parking.
Yes.
It could be
absolutely.
I park my car and I don't know where the signage is that shows me to where your department or where your counter is, and I'm getting already tense. I'm already start, my tense already starts there. So it could start from there. So those are the things that you got to put yourself in the shoe of these people who come to your office, who deal with you, and really maybe start. From that point onwards, perhaps. And of course, if you want to go further, then you go to see what's the first point of contact. Is it to website? Is it to things like that? So those are the things that I think empathize that I got from design thinking, how different or how they emphasize more. And I think the other one is the prototype. I think in some prototype, but the word rapid prototype. And I think from some of the videos that I've watched, is the idea behind it is that if you do the usual prototype, is you actually start building something physically, and it might cost money. It might take some time to actually build it, even though we know that it's maybe just a proof of concept. It doesn't look nice, but it's to prove the concept. But I think design thinking, my understanding is because the word design is there, it's very much about now how does the user interact with your solution. So they, I think if you see some video, they use cardboards, all these paper, colored paper, cardboards, and all those recycled things. So they cut it up and they say, okay, like again, if I use the example of the device for the banting, it will be like they'll come out maybe with a cardboard and then give a rough idea of how it looks like, how you interact with the device, and then you pass it to the user, the person who's going to use it, who are the enforcement people perhaps, and they'll say, okay, so how does this feel in the design? The device might not work, but it's just to get some feedback. So I think that's why there is that loop between the ideate, testing, prototype, and then testing, right? So it kind of loops. You get feedback, and then you improve your prototype, and then you do testing and so forth. So it's a loop, and then until you're really convinced, then say, okay, this is the way it's going to look like, and all that, the feel of it. Let's start building it, and then perhaps I'm sure there will be still that step of testing it, really on field testing and all that. So that's what I understand and get from design thinking, is that emphasis in that empathize, and I think rapid prototype. The rest, I think they are quite used to doing it in that way, analyzing the data that they have, doing testing and all that. They're quite familiar. So design thinking, that's so coming to what you've mentioned, it's true. Sometimes they feel that they need to show according to what doing something design thinking without realizing it. So it's just that you don't label it as design thinking. So I guess it's for us who evaluate, for those who say, congratulations, do you realize that what you've done is you're using design thinking, part of it. So it's not for us to start punishing us. Why didn't you call this design thinking?
Yes, that's right.
So sometimes they fear because they did not use the right term. But I think, but to me, I can see Rahmat is just joined us. Thank you. So I think it's very important that they know that it's more of the effort to innovate and come up with the
Absolutely.
idea.
You know, as I said, people have been coming up with good ideas and implementing them long before design thinking was ever created. So, you know, we have to see it as a set of tools and not as a rigid methodology that we follow.
That's right.
And I think, you know, you make very good points as well about the need to empathize, getting that understanding from the user point of view is really, really important, because if you start with a bad problem statement, or if you start with a bad premise, then your solution, you know, there's no recovery from that really. So, you know, that's very, very important. And rapid prototyping, again, it's, I think if you look at the world of tech and you know, software development and entrepreneurship, they have this fail fast concept. It's very much the same thing. It's better we find out in the first week what shape we should have the handle, rather than we try and build a whole tool only to find out the handle is the wrong shape, right? So the quicker we can fail and go through these cycles and loops, the better the product is at the end. But yeah, absolutely. I think there's some really useful tools in design thinking. But if you don't know it's design thinking and you're doing it anyway, it's just as good. It's just as good to us, right?
Yeah, it's in fact similar to Scamper. I'm not sure that if you're familiar with the Scamper kind of tool, which is to essentially to generate ideas. It basically stands for Scamper. It's a kind of a formula. So S stands for substitute, C stands for combine, adapt, modify or maximize, minimize. P is to put to other use, eliminate, and reverse. So the thing is, now the idea is that because tools are supposed to make things easy and help you. Now, if you had some ideas, perhaps Scamper is, I guess the reason for this idea generation tool is to get you out from your constraint, because you might have already a preconceived idea of what your solution should be. But especially if you're doing a project which involves other people in the group, as I always say that, you know, grassroots innovators, some of these garage innovators, they may be own money and they're doing it by themselves, you know. But if you're doing it in a group and you're part of the, maybe let's say you're the innovator who actually came up with the idea, you need to open up and welcome other possible solutions, you know, or at least a modification of your solution. So I think tools like Scamper is to encourage you to look into other aspects, and perhaps it could increase it could add on to other features of your innovation. However, sometimes I get, when I attend some of these competitions and all that, I see the documents, they will have Scamper being used. At each one of that word, Scamper is being used for the innovation, as if they feel that I need to show that I've used Scamper, so I've used everything, which I think it defeats the purpose, because, and especially when something doesn't relate. I mean, they could have something like reverse, and then when I say, but how do you say this is reverse? There's no element of reverse here, or they say eliminate, but it's not really eliminating because it's still there. It's just that maybe you've reduced it. So in a way, it's like, you know, we give you the tool, but you didn't really that you can see the tense in the sense that, look, the tools are supposed to help you. It's not supposed to give you more like work or more burden. It's supposed to assist you. Yeah. So sometimes they get the wrong idea and they say, oh, okay. So those are the things that sometimes we see it, but I try to be understanding, because I know that, you know, they're not I would say practitioners of innovation on a day-to-day basis. You know, they have their work and they are required to come up with projects. So I think, well done, you know, at least you're doing something. So I try not to punish, but of course, because, you know, there's a scale from 1 to 10, and those who have really understood and really practice the according to the criteria and all that. So we need to recognize those. But I would say it's something that they tend to get the wrong idea about what kind of tools they should use, on how they should present it. Yeah, and I think from what limited. I think there's also a very my favorite quotation that I read somewhere. In fact, it was actually part of the signage for the entrance into a. I think this was in Korea. Someone shared a picture, and it shows that the entrance has this, of course, in Korean, but translated in English, it says resources are limited, but creativity is unlimited. Yeah, so the ideas can come, but of course, ideas are useful if the ideas are logical and can be limited. But what we encourage all the ideas you get and that's part of the creativity. The challenge is now, how can I best use the ideas that I have, which ideas can meet or our limited resources that we have. So that's why it's creative, because if you're able to maybe think outside the box and really come up with something totally unheard of or never thought of, as you said, some innovation could be simple, like, gee, why didn't I think of that? So
yeah, absolutely, it doesn't always have to be complex, right?
But the next criteria is where I think if you look at the weightage, it's really big percentage. I think, and for the right reason, obvious reasons, because this is how we're going to really look at your innovation. What are the positive outcome and impact have you given or are able to show to your users, to the rakyat and all that. So that's, and actually for KIK, and I think for most of this kind of competition, the emphasis is on external customers. Although yes, there will be internal customers, but the emphasis has always been about for the rakyat, for the people. How does it benefit them? Some are able to show in the actual outcome. Some may say that because of the limited time, it may be a long-term thing. So long-term thing, perhaps this is where we look at the impact, the longer-term impact, positive, of course, positive impact. But as you mentioned, the byproduct of it, this is something I think. Am I right to say that this is where there any negative effect from your innovation? What are the steps have you taken in order to minimize those things, those maybe perhaps negative impact of your innovation? Is that what maybe is SDG really is talking about?
Yeah, I think it's related. I think it's related. So, there's a tendency for when people are presenting their ideas and their innovations to focus very much on the positive. Now, I can't think of a single idea, concept, innovation, product that doesn't have some negative associated with the positive. Everything we do is a balance. So we may make a lot of things better, but we always have to be conscious of what might be the negative impacts of that on broader society, on the stakeholders, on the users, everybody involved actually. So the SDGs look specifically at impact on society. So they would link the impact of the product or the process of the innovation to broader society. So I'll give an example. You create a brilliant new technology. It can make a product 100 times faster, 100 times cheaper, less environmental damage, but maybe that is putting people out of their job because, so now all of a sudden you have unemployed people. So there are always knock-on effects of every innovation, and no innovation is 100% positive. So for me, you just have to make sure that you look holistically. And the SDGs are designed to help you do that. To look, okay, does my product impact education? Does it impact the environment? Does it impact the marine environment? Does it, and it just gives you a framework to kind of look at society-based impact. So it's very useful. On the flip side, if your innovation shows a very positive impact on one of those areas, there is a lot of funding and grants available that are looking to promote SDG-based innovation. So it's, it works both ways.
Okay. Great. Apa ni? So actually, I'm just trying to look at our chat box, and I think Q&A, there is a question, which is something that I also wanted to touch on for all. So perhaps I will do a bit of bilingual section here just to reassure them. As mentioned to Ben also previously, this PSIA is essentially under MTE. It's actually an international platform. Yeah. So ever since we started in 2019, we have told all our potential attendees, participants, to submit in the international language, I guess, because they are open to the international is online. It's being promoted to all the other partner countries that are actually very familiar with the Malaysia Technology Expo. So they are actually potentially you get visitors from obviously outside Malaysia. So we do encourage. So to the question, pada soalan yang tanya, adakah dokumen perlu dalam bahasa Inggeris? So does it have, all the document has to be, okay, here's my explanation. Now in the submission, I believe there will be that section where you are asked to do a 500 words executive summary of your project, right? An executive summary of your project. Now that one, yes, please try to do that in English. Yeah, have that in English, because that will be your shop front. When you have a virtual booth, that will be part of the first thing that they will see also. So the English is also the other one, which is the 200, which is inovasi anda. So in 200 words, dalam 200 perkataan, describe. Yeah. So what do you talk about your product? Try to look at examples of bila dia macam kita nak jual. Yeah. It's like when you want to sell something, so you talk about the problem that it solves, the features that you have, what's unique about your innovation, so that in the 200 words of describing your product or your innovation. Yeah. So that one, definitely the very minimum, do that. Now, looking at your original or your existing document, which is under the KIK Horizon Baharu. Now, as I said, we make it easy by following exactly the criteria. Perhaps what you can do, you can upload your original document, which is fully in Bahasa Malaysia. But what I would encourage you to do is try to do a summary of each section, each criteria, and that summary, have it in Bahasa Malaysia. Have it in English. Have that in English, a summary of each of that criteria. How critical is this problem in your department or in your organization? Why do you choose to solve that problem? So you need to show some data, some facts in that. So perhaps those are the things that you will explain in English, kind of a summary of that. And throughout the whole document, try to sum up and get us to really, the evaluators to really understand, but not just evaluators, as I mentioned, this is open to the public to see and get to know your project and all that for the rakyat. So let them at least explain it, but you will have still your original document still there for people to for the public to see and all that. You can have like a poster of your product. I think there's a section when you submit, there'll be a section where you have like a poster. So what would the poster highlight? You have maybe your product, yeah, your innovation itself, name of your product, and some key features. So those are the things. Any other questions? So saya harap saya menjawab soalan Encik Nur Azlan Samudan. Dokumen boleh hantar dua-dua, tetapi buatlah satu rumusan kepada setiap satu bab, especially bab-bab yang berkaitan dengan pemakahan tu. Buat satu rumusan executive summary atau summary lah, dan mungkin point form, just point form, just some keywords, point form. I think we as evaluators we will understand, and of course we are hoping to get an international panelists this time around. Will be the first for this year. So the more you are able to present in English, it will be better. But if not, then I'll be the one having to do the word of translating on the go kind of thing. So that is basically the concern that has been raised. Which is validation means pengesahan, pengesahan untuk setiap satu peringkat yang anda lakukan dalam bila you tengah testing tu lah. And then the other thing that I find that in my engagement with the government servant is that when I meet with them, I always try to remind them, look, when you have someone in your group who is clearly the person behind the idea, who developed it, whatever that he or she shows you, it's a proof of concept. The initial part, it could be just a proof of concept. It doesn't look nice. Don't expect it to look nice and glossy and all that. This is just a proof of concept. He's just trying to show the proof of the concept that it solves. Yeah, in principle, it solves, but of course, it might look bulky. Let's say if it's a device or something, it might look very bulky and heavy and all that. But don't evaluate or don't show your support or disagreement to the idea by looking at the device, how it looks like. It's more, what does it do, the function, because the proof of concept streamlined, it can be sort of compressed a bit more and all that. So I always try to remind, don't like look down on some of these ideas that your members have come up with, because understand that this is a proof of concept. There is that stage of proof of concept, and then maybe you start doing your actual prototype in in terms of how it would it function in the actual day-to-day work process lah. Yeah, so that is something that I just wanted to also touch on that. Right, I think that's all from me at the moment. No other comments or suggestions or anything like that from the crowd. Anything else to add, Ben, before we sign off?
No, I think that's very good. Yeah.
Okay, so I think let me just come back to my slide and see whether, let me see, wait a minute, because I just got to miss out anything. So we've come to the end of our session. I believe, so I want to thank everyone, those who have attended, obviously, those who attended live, and those who have attended in terms of watching the recorded version of this. Understand that this is part of the evaluation criteria for Public Service Innovation Award. This is for 2022, and we've stayed the same basically from 2019, the same evaluation criteria, just that I think for now the difference will be, one of it is we are really encouraging you to share more of the proof of what you've declared, as much as possible to show proof, whether it's in the form of a letter that confirms from your head. This time around, I think we're really trying to encourage you to share as much as possible the documents in English, because it's an international event. So, and I think even the Malaysian Productivity Corporation, Ben, just for information, they also have their platform for encouraging innovations and all that. And their competitions also go overseas, but they really, you really got to go overseas and spend quite a bit, I understand, to actually go to like maybe Japan or Korea and all that. And I believe at that stage, they are required to come out in English. Yeah, they're supposed to translate all the documents. So sooner or later, you're going to have to do it if you want to, really go international. But here at MTE, PSIA MTE, you really don't need to fly, and you can't at the moment now. But we are bringing international evaluators, international audience to you here in Malaysia. That's the idea behind it. I could say the public sector lah. So try as much as possible to get it done, translate in English as much as possible. So I think that's all from us. Thank you again, Ben, for your time. I think we've went slightly beyond the time that I promised you.
Only just.
Thank you very much to only just. Thank you also to all the attendees. Let me see. I just see one more. Okay, just someone from Liana Ramli saying thank you to Mr. Benjamin, for sharing and advice in his experience from the industry. So it's always good to have perspective from the industry. So anyway, I think I'll pass on to Han Lee, who will be, I think at the moment, he will play a short video. But during that time, I think for all attendees, if you could turn on your camera to be on standby so that we can do a quick screenshot of all the attendees for. Thank you. And perhaps before we turn off that, I better go jump straight to this slide. I'm just afraid that we might miss the opportunity for me to also mention that there is our next series, and this will be looking at criteria number 4, which is the project outcome and impact. And this is by far the biggest weightage, is 53%, more than 50%. And joining us will be for this series is Tuan Saiful Yazan bin Alwi, also known as Sire. He's the Deputy DG of the National Registration Department of Malaysia. I knew him since he was in Intan, the training arm of the government, Intan in terms of innovation. And in fact, he joined MACRI, and he's also the Vice President of MACRI. So he will be sharing with us from his perspective of what should be your outcome and the impact of your project. And so don't miss it. You can do a screenshot for everyone, we're taking a week's break next week because of the Chinese New Year. So it won't be next week, it will be 2 weeks from now, which is 10th of February, same time. And please take note and then get in touch with the people from ProTem for the link and registration for this series.